The wind cut through Jacob Hayes like a promise of harder days ahead. He stood in the doorway of his barn, watching the gray light of New Year's morning spread across the Montana territory. Cold seeped through his coat, but he didn't move. His attention fixed on the wagon rolling past his property line. Ruth Winslow sat hunched on the driver's bench, her thin coat doing little against January's bite. The wagon bed held 3 covered baskets. Jacob had watched her load them before dawn. Working by lamplight in her yard, this was her 3rd pass. First to the Johnsons, who'd just had their 4th baby. Then to old Ezra's place, where consumption had him bedridden. Now she headed toward the Henderson Ranch, where drought had killed half their cattle. Jacob tracked the wagon's progress across the frozen landscape. He knew every dip in that road, every place the wheel would catch. Ruth's wagon had a worn rim that wobbled. She couldn't afford to fix it, couldn't afford much of anything. From what he could see, the sun climbed higher, pale and distant. Jacob went about his morning chores, but his mind stayed on that wagon, on the woman who gave and gave until nothing remained. Near noon, the wagon rattled past again, heading home. Empty now. Ruth's shoulders sagged lower than they had at dawn. Her posture spoke of exhaustion that went deeper than a single morning's work. Jacob stepped out of the barn. From here, he could see Ruth's cabin across the valley. Smoke struggled from a damaged chimney, thin and uncertain. The roof showed gaps where shingles had blown away. The fence leaned at angles that spoke of neglect. A memory rose, sharp as the wind. 2 winters passed. His mother in bed, coughing. The sound had filled their cabin like water filling a well, rising and rising until Jacob thought he'd drown in it. Then Ruth had appeared. A widow herself, she understood what suffering looked like. She brought soup 3 times a week without being asked, sat with his mother when Jacob had to work the ranch, read to her from the Bible in a voice soft as falling snow. The final night, Jacob had dozed in the corner chair, too exhausted to keep vigil. He'd woken to find Ruth holding his mother's hand, whispering prayers. His mother had died peacefully, not alone, because Ruth Winslow stayed. Jacob looked at Ruth's struggling chimney smoke, at the leaking roof, at the fence that couldn't protect a determined chicken, let alone anything that mattered. He'd carried gratitude like a stone for 2 years, heavy and cold and useless. Come morning, he'd turn that weight into something Ruth could use. The resolution settled in his chest, solid as fence posts driven deep. New Year's Day seemed the right time for such promises. A man ought to start the year with purpose. Jacob walked back into his barn and began gathering what he'd need. Salvaged shingles from a project last summer. Borrowed tar he'd return with interest. Tools worn smooth by his father's hands. Then his tomorrow. He'd begin. Jacob arrived at Ruth's cabin shortly after dawn on January 2nd. Frost covered everything, turning the world silver and sharp. He carried his ladder under one arm, a bucket of tar in his free hand. The shingles he'd stacked in his wagon bed. Ruth emerged from her cabin as he set the ladder against her roof. Confusion crossed her face, then something close to alarm. "Mr. Hayes," she said. Her breath fogged the air between them. "I didn't send for you." "No, ma'am." Jacob tested the ladder's stability. "Your roof did. I can't afford repairs right now." Her voice carried the practiced firmness of someone used to refusing help. Perhaps in spring, when not asking payment. He met her eyes. "Your roof's failing." "Mine knows the trade." Ruth's jaw tightened. She was perhaps 40, though hard years made age difficult to judge. Lines bracketed her mouth from smiling at other people's troubles while swallowing her own. "I manage fine. Mr. Hayes." Jacob glanced past her into the cabin's dim interior. 3 buckets sat scattered across the floor, catching drips from the damaged roof. The air inside would be damp and cold. Mold would be growing in the corners. "You've managed admirably," he said, "but winter's only half done." He started up the ladder before she could argue further. The ladder creaked under his weight. At the top, he surveyed the damage, worse than it had looked from the ground. A dozen shingles missing entirely, others cracked or curling. One good storm would flood her cabin. Below, Ruth stood with her arms crossed. She watched him work for several minutes, then retreated inside. But he saw her face in the window, checking his progress. Jacob worked methodically. Remove the damaged shingles, clean the exposed boards, apply tar, nail the new shingles in overlapping rows. His hands knew the rhythm. His father had taught him this work when Jacob was 12. The wind picked up near midday. It carried the scent of snow still weeks away. Jacob's fingers grew numb despite his gloves. He worked through it. Ruth appeared again at dusk, carrying a cup. "Coffee," she said. Not quite an offering. More an acknowledgement of reality. Obliged. Jacob climbed down and accepted the cup. The warmth felt good against his palms. They stood in awkward silence. Ruth stared at her fence line. Jacob studied his coffee. "Your mother was a kind woman." Ruth finally said, "I was glad to know her. She spoke well of you." Jacob sipped the coffee, strong and black. The way his mother had taken it. "Said you had a heart too big for this hard world." Something flickered in Ruth's expression. Pain. Maybe. Or recognition. "I'll finish tomorrow," Jacob said, handing back the cup. "Get the west slope done before dark." "Mr. Hayes." Ruth's voice stopped him at his wagon. "Why now?" The question hung between them like winter fog. Jacob didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound like pity, and Ruth Winslow didn't need anyone's pity. "Seems right to start the year with debts paid," he said instead. He drove home through gathering darkness. Behind him, Ruth's chimney smoke rose straighter now, protected by the work he'd done. But it still struggled, still spoke of something failing beneath the surface. For 2 days he hammered while she watched from windows. Neither spoke of what it meant, but the silence between them had changed. On the 3rd day, Jacob finished Ruth's roof. He worked carefully, checking each nail's depth, ensuring the shingles lay flat and secure. The January sun offered light but no warmth. His breath clouded with each exhale. As he hammered, memories surfaced unbidden. His mother's final months played behind his eyes like scenes from someone else's life. The cough had started in late summer, just a tickle at first. By autumn, it rattled her chest with every breath. Winter brought blood on the handkerchiefs she tried to hide from him. Jacob had worked the ranch harder those months, trying to earn enough for a doctor, trying to outrun the knowledge that no amount of money would matter. Consumption didn't care about a son's devotion or a widow's prayers. He'd come home one October evening to find Ruth Winslow at their table. She'd brought stew in a covered pot. His mother sat wrapped in blankets, smiling more genuinely than she had in weeks. "Mrs. Winslow understands," his mother had said that night, after Ruth left. "She's walked this road herself." Ruth had returned 3 times each week after that, sometimes with food, sometimes just to sit. She read aloud from books his mother loved, talked about small things, weather, chickens, the way light changed with the seasons, normal conversation that made dying feel less like an ending and more like a transition. The final night came in November. Jacob had been awake for 2 days straight. Exhaustion pulled at him like hands dragging him underwater. He dozed in the corner chair, meaning to rest his eyes for just a moment. He woke near dawn to find Ruth beside his mother's bed. She held his mother's hand, whispering prayers too soft for Jacob to hear. His mother's breathing had already stopped. Her face looked peaceful. Not alone. Ruth had stayed to help him wash the body and prepare it for burial. She'd organized the service, contacted neighbors, made sure Jacob ate something in those blurred days of grief. He'd thanked her. Of course, inadequate words for an unpayable debt. Ruth had simply nodded and said, "We help each other through. That's how we survive out here." Then she'd return to her own cabin and her own survival. Jacob had watched from a distance as she continued her rounds, bringing food to the Johnsons, sitting with old Ezra, helping the Hendersons butcher what cattle remained, always giving, never receiving. Jacob climbed down from Ruth's roof and began gathering his tools. The work was complete. The roof would hold now through spring storms and summer heat. Ruth could cross one worry off her list. She emerged from the cabin as he loaded his wagon. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said formally. "The work is well done." "Your well's next," he replied. Ruth blinked. "My well, notice the flow's weak. Pump's likely fouled. I'll be by Thursday with equipment." "Mr. Hayes, I can't—" She stopped, took a breath, started again. "This is too much." "You've already Thursday," Jacob said. He climbed onto his wagon bench. "Morning. If that suits." He drove away before she could protest further. In his mirror, he saw her standing in her yard, staring after him with an expression he couldn't quite read. That night, Jacob lay in bed listening to the wind test his own roof. He thought about Ruth's question, why now? The true answer was complicated. Guilt and gratitude. Yes, but also something else, a growing awareness of his own loneliness. The ranch felt emptier each year. Silence had weight to it, and Jacob was tired of carrying it alone. Maybe helping Ruth was selfish in its way. Maybe he needed to be needed to matter to someone the way his mother had mattered, the way Ruth clearly mattered to half the territory. Why now? She'd asked. Because 2 years was long enough to carry gratitude like a stone. Because winter was halfway done and her well was failing. Because watching her give until nothing remained made something in his chest ache with recognition. Because loneliness, he was learning, could be as dangerous as any Montana winter. Thursday arrived gray and heavy with the promise of snow. Jacob loaded his wagon with equipment borrowed from 3 different neighbors. A new pump mechanism, rope, pulleys, tools for descending into the well shaft. Ruth's well sat 20 yards from her cabin. The wooden housing had weathered to silver. The rope hung slack, the bucket resting at the bottom. When Jacob pulled it up, the water inside was cloudy and sparse. Ruth appeared in her doorway, wrapped in a shawl that had been mended too many times to count. "Mr. Hayes, this is becoming a habit." "Yes, ma'am." He began examining the pump mechanism. "Bad habits are hard to break." "I meant that you keep coming here to fix things." "So did I." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Then she retreated inside, though Jacob knew she'd be watching from the window. The work took 3 days. Jacob had to descend into the well shaft 30 feet down into darkness that smelled of earth and old water. He worked by lantern light, replacing the pump mechanism piece by piece. His shoulders scraped against stone walls. Cold seeped through his clothes until his bones felt like ice. On the second day, Ruth brought coffee during his afternoon break. She set the cup on the well housing without comment. Jacob emerged from the shaft, grateful for warmth. They stood in awkward silence. Jacob drank his coffee. Ruth studied the horizon. "My husband built this well." She finally said, "Year before he died. Took him a month of digging." Jacob nodded. He'd heard about Ruth's husband. Died in a logging accident 15 years back. No children. She'd been alone ever since. 15 years is a good run for a well, he said. 15 years is a long time for most things. Something in her voice made Jacob look up. Ruth's expression was distant, focused on memories he couldn't see. "You mentioned your husband died young," Jacob said carefully. 28. I was 25. Ruth wrapped her shawl tighter. "Seems like yesterday? Seems like someone else's life entirely?" "My mother said you understood suffering. Your mother was kind to say so." Ruth picked up his empty cup. "But we all suffer, Mr. Hayes. The question is whether we let it make us bitter or better." She returned to her cabin before he could respond. Jacob descended back into the well shaft, her words echoing in the darkness. On the 3rd day, he finished the repairs. Water flowed clear and cold again when he tested the pump. The bucket came up full, no longer struggling against a fouled mechanism. Ruth emerged to inspect the work. She drew a bucket, examined the water, tested the pump handle. "It flows better than it has in years," she said. "Should last another 15. With proper care." Ruth filled a dipper and offered it to him. The water tasted clean and cold, carrying the faint mineral tang of deep earth. When Jacob drank, Ruth smiled, brief as dawn breaking, but real. "You've been very generous with your time, Mr. Hayes." "Call me Jacob. Mr. Hayes was my father." "Then you should call me Ruth." He nodded. A small threshold crossed. Names instead of titles. The formality between them shifting towards something more familiar. "I'll be back next week," Jacob said, loading his equipment. "Your fences listing won't hold chickens much longer, let alone anything that matters." Ruth opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. She studied him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Wariness mixed with something that might have been curiosity. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked. Jacob paused at his wagon. The question deserved honesty, but he didn't fully understand his own motivations yet. "Maybe I'm tired of eating my own cooking," he said instead. "Maybe I like having somewhere to go besides my own empty ranch." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough. Ruth nodded slowly. "Next week, then." Jacob drove home through gathering dusk. Behind him, Ruth's chimney smoke rose steady now, protected by the repairs he'd made. But he thought about her question all the way home. Why did he keep coming back? The answer was forming, but he wasn't ready to speak it yet. Late February brought the first thaw. Icicles dripped from eaves. Snow retreated from south-facing slopes. The air carried the faint promise of spring still weeks away. Jacob arrived at Ruth's property with fence posts and wire. Her fence leaned at dangerous angles, held together more by habit than structure. He'd counted at least 6 chickens roaming free. Having found gaps in the barrier, Ruth emerged from her cabin wearing a dress he'd seen her wear before. Most of her dresses, he'd noticed, had been worn before, mended and remended, faded from washing. She owned perhaps 3 in total. "Your fence crew has arrived," Jacob called. "So I see." Ruth crossed her arms. "I didn't realize I'd hired a fence crew." "You didn't? I volunteered." "Mr. Hayes, Jacob, this is becoming excessive. Your chickens disagree. Found 3 in my yard yesterday." That was a lie, but it made Ruth smile. She shook her head and returned inside. But within an hour she emerged with coffee and bread. They ate in companionable silence, sitting on her porch steps. "Tell me about your ranch," Ruth said. "I've never actually visited it." Jacob described the property. 200 acres, most of it too rocky for crops. He ran cattle, though not many. The barn needed work. The house felt too large for one person. "It was my father's," he said. "And his father's before that. I keep thinking I should do something with it besides just survive." "Survival isn't nothing," Ruth said quietly. "No, but it's not everything either." They talked while Jacob worked. Ruth asked about his parents, his childhood, his plans for spring. Jacob found himself sharing more than he'd intended. She had a way of listening that made words flow easier. In turn, Ruth spoke about her years alone, how she'd started helping neighbors because sitting still meant facing silence, how giving to others filled spaces in her heart that nothing else could reach. "But the quiet still gets to me," she admitted. "Some nights it's so loud I can't sleep." Jacob understood that perfectly. He nodded and kept working. Over the next week, he returned each afternoon. The fence took longer than necessary, but Jacob found reasons to extend the project, adjusting post depths, ensuring wire tension, details that mattered less than the conversation. One evening, as the sun painted the horizon orange and gold, Ruth invited him inside for supper. The invitation caught Jacob off guard. He hesitated on the threshold, aware that crossing it meant something. "Just beans and bread," Ruth said. "But there's plenty." Her cabin was smaller inside than it looked from outside. One room serving as kitchen, sitting area, and bedroom. Everything worn but clean. Jacob noticed the emptiness, no pictures on walls. Few books. Sparse furniture. She'd given away everything that wasn't essential. They ate at a small table by the window. The food was simple but good. Ruth apologized for its plainness. Jacob told her it was the best meal he'd had in months, which was true. "I help because sitting still means facing how quiet it gets," Ruth said, continuing a conversation from days earlier. "But with you here, working on the fence, talking, the quiet doesn't ache the same way." Jacob set down his fork. "I know what you mean. My ranch feels emptier every year, like the walls are moving closer. Loneliness has weight to it." Ruth said, "Yes, it does." They finished the meal in silence. But it was a different kind of quiet, shared instead of solitary. Comfortable instead of aching, walking home under stars. Jacob realized he'd laughed twice during supper. He couldn't remember the last time before tonight. The sound of his own laughter felt foreign and wonderful. The fence was finished, but Jacob knew he'd find another reason to return. Early March arrived cold and stubborn. Winter wasn't finished yet. The brief thaw reversed into freezing nights and gray days. Jacob approached Ruth's cabin with materials for repairing her henhouse. The structure leaned dangerously, its roof half collapsed. But when he arrived, Ruth stood firm in her doorway, blocking his path. "No more. Jacob." He stopped, surprised by the steel in her voice. "The henhouse won't last till spring," he said. "That's not what I mean." Ruth stepped out. Closing the door behind her, her face was set in hard lines. "I need to know why you keep coming." "I told you. Debts to repay." "You've done enough to repay any debt." Her voice shook slightly. "This is something else." Jacob set down his tools. He'd known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it easier. "Your kindness to my mother," he began, "was 2 years ago." Ruth cut him off. "You've repaired my roof, my well, my fence. You've had supper at my table. This isn't about your mother anymore." The words hung between them, sharp as the wind cutting across the yard. Jacob searched for the right answer. He'd been avoiding this question for weeks, even in his own thoughts. The truth was complicated and frightening. Admitting he'd come to need these visits meant admitting loneliness had driven him here, meant admitting she mattered more than repaying debts. "I don't know what you want me to say." He finally managed. "The truth." Ruth's eyes were bright, whether from cold or emotion he couldn't tell. "I can't let myself need this." "Need you? I don't know how." The confession struck Jacob like a physical blow. She was afraid, not of him, but of hope itself, of depending and being disappointed. "Ruth, please go." She retreated toward her door. "I need to think." Jacob gathered his tools slowly, giving her time to change her mind. She didn't. The door closed firmly behind her. He drove home through gathering dusk, the conversation replaying in his mind. He'd handled it poorly, said the wrong things, or not said the right ones. That night, Jacob lay awake listening to the wind. He thought about Ruth's words. "I can't let myself need this." The vulnerability in her voice, the fear. He understood that fear. Opening yourself to someone meant risking pain. Ruth had lost a husband. Jacob had lost a mother. Both had learned that loving people meant eventually losing them. But living without connection meant a different kind of loss. A slower dying. 3 days passed. Jacob didn't visit. He worked his own ranch, mended his own fences, ate his own cooking. The silence felt heavier than before. He'd grown accustomed to Ruth's company, to conversation and coffee and shared suppers. Now, absence filled the spaces where she'd been. On the third night, Jacob admitted the truth to himself. He was falling in love with Ruth Winslow. Maybe had been for weeks. The realization terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He'd started this to honor his mother. But somewhere in the fixing and talking and shared silences, duty had transformed into something deeper. Something that had nothing to do with debts and everything to do with waking up with purpose. Ruth's question echoed. Why do you keep coming back? Because you matter. He thought. Because I see you. Because in helping you, I help myself. Because loneliness is killing us both. And maybe together we could survive. Dawn on the fourth day found Jacob hitching his wagon. He drove to Ruth's cabin through cold that bit like broken teeth. Frost covered everything. The world felt brittle and sharp. Ruth's chimney produced no smoke. The cabin looked abandoned in the pale light. For a moment, panic seized Jacob's chest. Then the door opened. Ruth stood in the doorway wearing the same dress from 3 days ago. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She looked like she hadn't slept. Jacob climbed down from his wagon. They stared at each other across the frozen yard. I'm sorry, he said. For not being honest. For making you ask questions I should have answered weeks ago. Ruth wrapped her arms around herself. I've barely slept since you left. Neither have I. The admission hung between them. Ruth's breath fogged the air. She looked small and tired and achingly beautiful. Why do you keep coming back? She asked again. Softer this time, genuinely wanting to know. Jacob took a breath. Truth. Then, all of it. I started this to honor my mother. She cared about you. She'd want someone to care for you the way you cared for her. He paused. But somewhere in the fixing, I stopped thinking about debts. I come because your voice is the first sound I want to hear when I wake. Because coffee tastes better at your table. Because talking with you makes the world feel less empty. Ruth's eyes glistened. When I imagine spring, Jacob continued, I see it with you. Not because I owe you, but because I want to. Because these weeks have been the best I've known in years. Because I'm tired of being alone, and I think you are too. A tear traced down Ruth's cheek. She brushed it away impatiently. I'm afraid, she whispered. I don't know how to let someone help me. I don't know how to need someone again. Then we'll learn together. Jacob stepped closer. You taught me what kindness looks like. Let me teach you what you deserve. Which is someone who stays, someone who sees you carrying the world and helps shoulder the weight. Someone who knows loneliness and wants to fight it alongside you. Ruth made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. I don't know if I remember how to what? How to not be alone. Jacob reached for her hands. They were cold despite the shawl wrapped around her shoulders, work-worn and strong and trembling slightly. We'll figure it out, he said, together. Ruth looked at their joined hands. Years of giving had carved lines into her palms. Years of receiving nothing had taught her to expect emptiness. But standing here, holding Jacob's hands, something in her expression shifted. I've been sitting here for 3 days, she said, thinking about why your absence hurt so much. Why I kept looking out the window, hoping to see your wagon. I told myself it was just habit, just getting used to company. But, Jacob prompted gently, but I was lying to myself. Ruth met his eyes. I miss you when you're gone. I look forward to your visits. I've started imagining what it would be like if you didn't leave. The confession cost her. Jacob could see it in the tension of her shoulders, the vulnerability in her expression. I'm scared too, he admitted. Scared of needing someone. Scared of losing them. But I'm more scared of living the rest of my life this alone. Ruth nodded slowly. What do we do now? We start over. No debts. No obligations. Just two people who are tired of being lonely. And if it doesn't work, then at least we tried. Jacob squeezed her hands gently. but I think it will. Ruth studied his face for a long moment. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once. Decisive. Come inside, she said. I'll make coffee, real coffee, not the watered-down excuse I've been serving. Jacob followed her into the cabin. It was cold inside, she hadn't lit a fire yet. He built one while Ruth worked at the stove. The flames caught and grew, spreading warmth through the small space. They sat at her table with coffee and the last of her bread. Outside, the sun climbed higher, melting frost into water. Icicles dripped from the eaves. The sound was like time itself thawing. Spring's coming, Ruth said, staring out the window. Yes, Jacob agreed, and we'll meet it together. She smiled then, a real smile, full and genuine. It transformed her face, erasing years of weariness. Together, she repeated, testing the word, finding it good. Late March arrived with the first real warmth. The land softened. Grass showed green beneath melting snow. Birds returned in chattering flocks. Jacob and Ruth spent the intervening weeks learning each other. He visited daily now. No pretense of repairs needed. They talked for hours, shared meals, walked the land together. Ruth showed him where wildflowers would bloom in spring. Jacob taught her about cattle and horses. They traded stories, hers of widowhood and survival, his of growing up on a ranch that demanded everything and gave back just enough to keep going. Slowly, Ruth began accepting help without flinching. Jacob brought groceries she didn't protest, fixed things she admitted needed fixing, stayed longer each visit until leaving felt wrong. One evening in early April, they sat on Ruth's porch watching sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. The air smelled of growing things. Winter's grip had finally broken. I have a question, Jacob said. Ruth glanced at him. Another one. An important one. Something in his tone made her straighten. She set down her coffee cup and waited. Jacob had rehearsed this moment a dozen times, lying awake at night, words carefully chosen and arranged. But now, with Ruth watching him, all those practiced speeches evaporated. Why do I keep coming back? He said instead. You asked me that weeks ago. I gave you an answer, but not the whole truth. Why, and what's the whole truth? My New Year's resolution was to help you. To repay the kindness you showed my mother. To fix your roof and well and fence and make sure you had what you needed. Jacob paused. But somewhere along the way, it became my reason to wake up. Ruth's breath caught. Helping you stopped being about debts. Jacob continued. It became about you, about us, about building something neither of us has had in too long. Which is a reason to come home, someone who cares if we're late for supper, someone who knows our stories and wants to hear more, someone to face spring with, and summer, and all the seasons after. Jacob reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band, his mother's ring. She'd left it to him, with instructions to give it to someone worthy. Ruth Winslow, I'm asking if you'll marry me. Not because I owe you, but because I love you. Because these weeks with you have been the best of my life. Because I want to help you, and be helped by you. For whatever years we have left. Tears streamed down Ruth's face. She pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. I don't have much to offer, Jacob said quietly. A struggling ranch. A house that needs work. A man who's better with cattle than words. But I can promise you won't face another day alone. That your kindness will be returned. That you'll finally have someone to help you the way you've helped everyone else. Ruth lowered her hand. You're wrong, she said, voice thick with emotion. Jacob's heart sank. I understand if you're wrong that you don't have much to offer. Ruth took the ring from his palm, examining it in the fading light. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope. Ruth slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Yes, Jacob Hayes. I'll marry you. Relief and joy flooded through him in equal measure. He pulled Ruth close, holding her carefully, as if she might break. She didn't break. She held him back just as tightly. We'll help each other, she whispered against his shoulder. That's how we survive. That's how we live, Jacob corrected. They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged. The air turned cool, but they didn't move. Ruth's head rested on Jacob's shoulder. His arm circled her waist. Winter was over. Spring had finally come. And for the first time in years, neither of them faced it alone. Apple blossoms drifted on the April breeze like snow that brought life instead of cold. Jacob stood beneath the trees in town, watching neighbors gather. The Johnsons, old Ezra, leaning on a cane but present. The Hendersons, their ranch saved by good cattle prices. All the families Ruth had helped over the years. All of them here to witness her happiness. Ruth emerged from the church in a dress borrowed from the preacher's wife. Simple white cotton, embroidered with flowers. She'd protested the fuss, said a quiet ceremony would do. But the community insisted. Ruth had given too much for too long. They wanted to give back. Jacob met her at the church steps. She smiled up at him, eyes bright with joy instead of tears. You look beautiful, he said. You look nervous. I am. Good. So am I. They walked together beneath the apple trees. The preacher stood waiting, Bible open. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. Traditional vows spoken with genuine weight. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed Ruth gently. Applause rose from the gathered crowd. Someone, probably Mrs. Johnson, was crying. The celebration afterward was simple but warm. Food shared from a dozen kitchens. Music from a borrowed fiddle, dancing in the churchyard as the sun climbed higher. Ruth danced with Jacob, then with old Ezra, then with the Henderson boys. Her laughter carried on the breeze. Jacob had never seen her so happy. The weariness that had marked her features for years had lifted. She looked younger, lighter. Late in the afternoon, they said their goodbyes and drove to Jacob's ranch. Ruth's few possessions already loaded in the wagon. She owned so little it all fit in 2 trunks. Home, Jacob said as the ranch came into view. Ruth smiled. Our home. They spent the evening settling her belongings. Ruth hung her 3 dresses in the closet beside Jacob's shirts, placed her Bible on the nightstand, set her mother's quilt across their bed. Small changes that transformed the house, made it lived in, made it whole as darkness fell. They sat on the porch watching stars emerge. The air smelled of apple blossoms and fresh-turned earth. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. The sound was peaceful, ordinary, perfect. Are you happy? Jacob asked. Ruth leaned against his shoulder. More than I thought possible. Any regrets? Only that I didn't let you help me sooner. Jacob wrapped his arm around her. We have time now, years of it, God willing. What will we do with all that time? Help each other, build something good. Maybe help some neighbors along the way, Ruth nodded. But ourselves first. Ourselves first, Jacob agreed. They'd both learned that lesson the hard way. You couldn't pour from an empty vessel, couldn't give what you didn't have. Helping others mattered, but not at the cost of destroying yourself. Together, they'd find balance. Give and receive in equal measure. Support the community without sacrificing their own well-being. The next morning, Ruth woke to find Jacob already up. She found him in the kitchen, making coffee. Sunlight streamed through clean windows. The stove radiated warmth. Through the window, she could see the ranch spread before them, fences strong and straight, barn roof repaired, garden plot ready for planting, everything mended, everything whole. Smoke rose from the chimney, steady and sure. No longer struggling like it had from her old cabin, no longer uncertain. Jacob handed her a cup of coffee. Their fingers touched. Both smiled at the contact. "First morning," he said. "First of many." They stood together at the window, watching the sun climb higher, watching the world wake up around them. Spring was here in full force now, green spreading across brown earth, flowers opening, life returning. Ruth thought about New Year's Day, months ago, watching Jacob watch her from his barn. How exhausted she'd been. How alone. She thought about all the years before that, giving until nothing remained, helping everyone but herself, walking through life with an empty vessel, wondering why nothing filled it. Now, standing in her husband's kitchen, their kitchen she understood. You couldn't earn love through service, couldn't purchase belonging with sacrifice. Sometimes you had to accept help, had to admit need, had to let someone else carry the weight. "What are you thinking?" Jacob asked. "That I'm grateful you made that resolution. To help you, to see me." Ruth squeezed his hand. "Really see me?" Jacob pulled her close. They stood together in the morning light. Two helpers who'd finally found someone to help them. Outside, the wind carried apple blossoms across green fields. Winter was over. Spring had come. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, they weren't facing it alone. They were home.